This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised. A young woman is stalked for over a decade, but when the stalker's identity comes to light, will it wreck everything she's ever known? This is the Sarah Garone story. Hi, Amy. How are you?
Hello, Meghan. What's going on?
Nothing. I'm just recouping from the visit from my family. My entire family was here this weekend. It was awesome. They came to meet Hannah.
That's so nice.
But, it was even better. Aunt Amy just visited Hannah and spent the night here, and that was wonderful, too.
I love her. She's such a sweetie.
Yeah, she really is. And it's clear that she loves you. She, sat in your arms the whole time. But I'll stop talking about my baby, though, and get to the real reason we're here today. Today's episode was one that I was asked to do a television show on. So I was asked to appear as an expert on, we get asked to do appearances sometimes. And this one was an episode of the show Evil Lives Here. And there was a companion show that kind of followed that one or went with it called Talking Evil. Now, I wound up doing a different case, but originally this one was on the potential roster, so I was pretty familiar with it. When I was asked to do it, I made a note to cover it on the podcast because it's kind of unique. It's definitely a little bit different than the cases we do, and the motives are a little bit harder to understand. I love picking cases where the motives are not clear.
Yes.
Because I like when we can dissect them a little bit. So in this case, again, I think you're going to find not so straightforward. A lot of times when we look at crimes, we look through a utilitarian lens, I did it for the money. I needed revenge. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's not as straightforward. And I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Okay.
I look forward, though, to the discussion with you and with our listeners. So let's meet the subject of today's episode. Sarah Garone was born in the early 1980s. And not long after her birth, her parents separated and she moved with her mother and older brother to Chandler, Arizona, which is a city just southeast of Phoenix. While her mother was single until Sarah was around 8 years old, she eventually met a man named Gary Hardy at a local church. And Sarah gained a stepfather only 3 months after her mom began dating Gary. So they married pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Sarah was happy for her mom, though. She said it was a good time in her life. She even began to call Gary Dad, which created an even more special bond within the family. But Sarah said that there were things that bothered her, like annoying hugs from a fuddy-duddy kind of dad. But altogether, it was fine. So they lived together, and as Sarah entered the 9th grade in 1996, she became excited for a lot of new opportunities, as most high schoolers do, which included cheer tryouts. Did you do this, Amy? Did you try out for cheer?
What do you think, Meghan? Do I look like a cheerleader to you?
I mean, definitely not, but I will say, just so you know, I was very excited for cheer tryouts.
I know you. You're definitely a cheerleader type.
I don't know what that means, Amy, but I'm gonna say that I was also a gymnast and I have a lot of enthusiasm. So I thought
I just mean you have a lot of enthusiasm in general. That's all. I don't mean anything else.
All right, I'll take that for for the compliment it is. But I have to tell you that it was really heartbreaking for me because I had to miss cheer tryouts because I had to have my tonsils out. Literally exactly when cheer tryouts happened because I got so sick, and so I was heartbroken. This is clearly just my own side note, but I just wanted everyone to know that I really did want to become a cheerleader too.
Okay.
Unlike me, though, Sarah did not miss tryouts, and every day she would run to the mailbox to see if she got a letter of acceptance, because remember, things came in the mail then.
Yes.
To her delight, a letter did arrive for her in her mailbox with her name and address and even the school's return address. It even had the acronym for the cheer squad.
Oh.
This was her moment. So Sarah brought the envelope inside and opened it. But instead of a cheer squad acceptance letter, the envelope was filled with pages of photocopied pornography. Yeah.
Of who? Like random people?
Strangers,
okay.
Yes. Nobody she knew, let's put it that way. And again, these were photocopies.
That's weird.
This wasn't actual magazines or whatnot. Keep in mind the time is 1996. So remember, Sarah's only in ninth grade at the time, and I think she was kind of an innocent ninth grader, and she was really upset by the images that she received and the fact that this was addressed to her from her school. She immediately brought this to her parents, who were also very shocked. Gary called the police right away, and they came to the house to take a report, asking if Sarah had any enemies, trying to figure out who might send this. But Sarah really couldn't think of anybody who would want to do this. Gary vowed to protect his stepdaughter, and Sarah's parents told her not to worry about it. It was probably just a prank, a bad prank, but to tell them if she had any fears going forward or if she wanted to talk about her feelings with them or anybody else. Around this time, Sarah began journaling about her experiences, and the journaling process became very important to her. You still journal every night, right?
I do, but I do it the lazy way. Do you ever see those ones that are like just a few lines for like each day?
No.
Yes, I forget. It's called like a line a day. So you literally put in like 2 lines about each day.
Well, why do that? I'm just curious. I know why she was journaling. It was an expression of her feelings at the time, but like why would someone journal for 2 lines a day? I'm just curious.
I've always kept a journal, so for me, it's just I've always kept one, so I wanted to keep up with it, but I just don't have like the time to fully write in it. So
Okay.
it's like it's a good way to remember like certain events.
Okay.
So let's say I was like away that day. I'd be like, had a great time at the Taylor Swift concert in London. So then next year, when I go to write on that day, I could look back and see what I did on that same date last year, the year before, the year before.
Got it. Do you look back at your journals?
Never.
Okay. But you will someday, probably.
One day I might.
Yeah. Anyway, back to we could talk about your journaling another time. So, like I said, this became important to Sarah, especially since she kind of felt like this is high school and she felt like this was a personal attack, this pornography thing. And remember, this is a sensitive time for a lot of kids. So as much as journaling was important to Sarah, though, she began to misplace her journals, which became a source of her frustration. So just keep that in mind. She was getting a little bit forgetful. So she had a few things going on here, and I think they were weighing on her. But as time went on and she never got another weird letter in the mail, she basically tried to get back to normal and not to think about it so much. But a year later, Sarah found a second envelope addressed to her in the family mailbox again. This time, there wasn't a return address, and Sarah got like a pit in her stomach, sensing that this might be a bad letter again, so to speak. But she opened the envelope, and this time it contained color photos of pornography, along with a message on a blank piece of printer paper. In what appeared to be red paint or nail polish, the phrases, "I want you, I need you, Hans," were written.
What was the last part?
Hans, the name Hans.
Okay.
So Hans was a boy from Sarah's school.
Okay.
He was a foreign exchange student who Sarah had a crush on. But Sarah was a smart girl, and she knew pretty quickly this package could not be from Hans. The reason why, you ask?
I was just going to say why.
Okay, because it was similar to the first package, which she received 1 year prior. And at that time, Hans was not yet at her school.
Okay.
So if it was the same package or the same person who sent the first package, it couldn't have been Hans. So at least she thought it wasn't him. But she was definitely scared. I mean, this one, again, in red paint, maybe even insinuating could have been red blood. "I want you, I need you."
Yeah.
She brought the package to her parents again. They were comforting, of course. But Gary noticed something important about this envelope. Despite the fact that it didn't have a return address, the stamp had been put on the envelope upside down.
Okay.
So Gary theorized that perhaps this wasn't someone who meant Sarah harm, but someone who wanted the opposite, because apparently putting a stamp upside down was a symbol of love. Did you know that?
What? I've never heard of that.
I'd never heard of that before either. So I don't know if he was saying this just to comfort Sarah, like maybe this is someone who just is trying to express their love and they don't know how. Either way, Sarah didn't feel very loved. She was sick to her stomach, and unfortunately, this would not be the last pornographic mail she received. Several more arrived over the course of her high school years, but she continued to ignore them, focusing instead on her plans for college. The police were never able to track the identity of the stalker. And at age 17, Sarah was college-bound for a school in Chicago, and she hoped that she'd be leaving the stalker behind. And it seemed that Sarah had, for a bit, as she received no more strange mail in Chicago. She also met a young man named Anthony, a computer science student. And after a few years of dating, the pair became engaged during college. But much to Sarah's horror, around the time of her engagement, odd emails began showing up in her inbox. So this is interesting because this is that kind of time where you transition 1996 high school and 2000 college. I'm the exact same age as Sarah. So that's when I started using email as well.
Yeah, so that's why I'm assuming the stalking behavior is just changing with the times.
Yes, I would think so as well. Technology provides a whole new avenue for new crimes, right? Sarah at this time would receive subscriptions for lingerie that she never signed up for, as well as other items of a sexualized nature. So she kept getting these emails from sources that were basically containing, again, sexual images and other items. But then things also took a turn. Her friends suddenly began receiving intimate email exchanges that she was having with her fiancé at the time. So these messages, it seemed that someone had hacked her email and was sending Sarah's private messages to her entire contact list.
I'm assuming that she didn't think it was her fiance.
I don't think so, no.
Okay.
But as you can imagine, this is very targeted. This is very shocking. This is devastating. It's embarrassing. At this point, it was like, who is doing this and why? It had been several years. And was this actually a new stalker and something totally different? Or was this related to her stalker who sent her pornography? Because it was a little bit different. Now, as a computer science major, her fiance offered to help. So Anthony traced the emails and the origins and found out that they originated in the town where Sarah grew up.
I think I know what's happening.
Okay, hold that thought.
Okay.
But could it be the same stalker? Again, was this someone from her high school, from her past? Or was this an attempt to throw off? You know, you could throw off, I guess, IP addresses. Is that correct? I don't know much about computers.
That long ago, though, that would be someone who's really technologically savvy.
Right. So Sarah was obviously upset. She called her parents again, her mother and her stepfather. She told them what was happening. And the family felt pretty sure that it was someone from Sarah's high school past. But the question was, who? Despite the awful hacking, Sarah turned her attentions to planning her wedding, and she and Anthony moved back to Arizona and got their own place not far from where Sarah grew up. They got married, and throughout her newlywed years, Sarah had continued journaling. But remember when I said that she misplaced her journals a lot when she'd been in high school, or she began misplacing them? Well, that began happening again. Sarah's journals were suddenly going missing. She couldn't remember where she put them.
Okay, who has access to her house besides Anthony?
Well, let's see if anyone has access, because beyond that, what's even worse is that she felt like her underwear kept disappearing.
Ooh, okay.
Right. Sarah kind of felt crazy and wondered if someone been coming into her apartment, or was this just her misplacing things? So Anthony changed the locks. But this didn't assuage her fears, as only a few months after returning from their honeymoon, Sarah came home from work and found a box on her doorstep. Assuming that this was just a late wedding present, Sarah was shocked to open it and find sex toys with a label containing Anthony's name inside of it this time. And that's her husband.
So meaning like whoever is doing this is now targeting her husband.
Well, it's addressed to her, but it's got his name on it.
Got it.
Which is confusing. I'm not sure what the purpose of putting his name on it. Is it just to say this is from him or it involves him? I'm not quite sure. This one felt more personal to Sarah, though, more so than anything else she'd received. And what's worse was that her apartment was unlocked. So this is escalated. Now someone's breaking into her apartment. So
do they not
she's afraid.
They don't have surveillance cameras? It's too long ago.
They did not have surveillance cameras, no.
Okay.
And this was early. This is the early 2000s. Oh my gosh, about 20 years ago. So Sarah called Anthony frantically, thinking the home invader might still be around. But he didn't answer, so Sarah called the other man in her life. She called her stepfather. So Gary came over immediately. He inspected the home, and he called the police again. And at this point, Gary was very angry with the local police that his stepdaughter had been dealing with a stalker since high school. And this is about 9 years. It spanned over that course of time. So Gary demanded that they take Sarah's case more seriously, especially because he'd pointed to the evidence of a break-in now. And this time, with the evidence of the break-in, the police did begin a serious investigation. And guess what? Well, they called her not long after the break-in to say that they'd finally identified her stalker. And while she had apprehension about finally learning who it was, Nothing really could have prepared her for the reality. So, Amy, who do you believe the longtime stalker was?
It's her stepfather.
That's correct. It was Gary,
Disgusting.
her stepfather.
Jeez. Did he have keys to her new apartment, or he was actually breaking in?
He had keys to her apartment.
Oh.
But why? I mean, Sarah was shocked and horrified. The cops had to be wrong, she thought. It couldn't have been the man she was calling dad since she was 8 years old, especially since he'd also been the one to really demand and push forward the investigation. But the police were not wrong, and it hadn't even taken fancy computer work or covert operations to reveal his involvement. Gary had actually incriminated himself quite accidentally. You see, Gary's administrative assistant was responsible for opening his mail. And days before the sex toy box had arrived at Sarah's apartment, the administrative assistant had opened a package addressed to Gary, and it contained a sex toy. Now, probably being a bit embarrassed about this, the administrative assistant sealed up the personal package and left it with Gary, never discussing what she had seen, because why would she?
Yeah.
But after Gary told his assistant about the break-in and the strange package at Sarah's apartment, the entire situation set off alarm bells in her head, as the sex toy he described Sarah opening was the exact one she had found in his mail just days earlier. So she knew that it belonged to Gary. And she did the right thing, and she contacted authorities, reporting what she knew. And the police were able to connect the dots based on this information. Now, Sarah was hurt, but not necessarily shocked when she really thought about it, because she realized from her childhood that there were many red flags about Gary that she'd ignored.
Well, you mentioned something about her not liking his hugs or something, so that's what tipped me off.
I know. I figured that was the tip-off. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of those. I'll start with the hugs. She said that the hugs were weird because they were always a little too long. Like, it felt like he wouldn't let go. Now, she said that she wrote that off as Gary trying really hard to be a surrogate dad type. But she also said there were looks that he used to give her when she became a teenager. Also, looks that were just too long and wandering, not the kind of looks you would expect a father to give a daughter.
Did she ever talk to her mother about these concerns, or she thought that like she was maybe it was in her head?
No, she didn't really speak to her mother about it. Or if she did, I just didn't see that information. She said in hindsight, too, that she realized Gary treated her more like a date if the two of them went out together, which had always felt kind of wrong, but she just couldn't place why. Like, she felt he almost attended to her more like a girlfriend rather than a daughter when they were out in public, which is very weird, also considering how young she was.
Yeah.
But the most solidifying factor for Sarah was in finding out that Gary had a pornography addiction. In fact, so much so that he was fired for viewing it at work. That was a point of contention between him and her mother. So Sarah knew that this had happened, and she thought about the packages that she received, but still didn't think there was any way that her stepfather would be sending her pornography. Sarah also reported one final very creepy factor, and that was the fact that she felt like she was being watched from her window at times, and said that she even noticed at one point that a section of her blinds was bent and then eventually missing. Almost like someone had removed it and could watch her. Awful, right?
So disturbing. I'm sorry, did she have any siblings?
She did not.
Okay.
Now, at the time that the police informed Sarah that Gary was her stalker, her parents were splitting their time between a house in Illinois and a house in Arizona. And Gary was in Illinois at the time. The police really wanted Gary to come back on his own, and while Sarah was too disgusted to face Gary, when her mother asked if Sarah's stalker was Gary, she told her mother the truth. So her mother had an inkling as well. Amy, I really kind of think that they both suspected it was him for a long time.
Really?
But didn't want to believe that. You know, it was her mother's husband. They were a family, and I think neither of them really wanted to think that he was possible of this. Nevertheless, both Sarah and her mother, Sherry, knew what needed to be done. And so Sherry, pretending not to know anything, went about convincing Gary to return to Phoenix so they could help with the investigation. Now, a disgusted Sherry had to continue pretending not to know anything while also mounting her own investigation of their home. Sherry found that not only was Gary guilty of harassing her daughter, but he was also committing credit card fraud in her name.
This always happens. It's like once you find one thing, there's Many other things that got uncovered.
Yes. And I think at this point, she really was thinking, who was this man she had married and she'd met at church of all places? But Sherry kept quiet because she wanted to get him back to Illinois. And the night they were leaving to head back to Arizona, Gary went into a state of panic, falling to the floor and stating that he felt possessed. Shaking, he told Sherry that he'd been the one to stalk Sarah.
Oh.
Yes, but also that he'd been patronizing sex workers on a daily basis their entire marriage.
Wow. He probably knew that everything was about to come crumbling down.
Yes, and a horrified Sherry had to fake support, staying awake that entire evening. Her only goal, she said, was to get Gary on the plane the next day. She was successful. Gary thought she was supporting him and they were going to work things out, but the whole time, Sherry knew very differently.
Mm-hmm.
He got on the plane, and later that day, she took him to the Arizona police where he confessed to his crimes and was arrested. Gary was charged with harassment, theft, and attempted exploitation of a minor. Now, he was offered a plea, which would only give him a few years in prison, but he refused to take it and decided to go to trial.
Why?
Which surprised me, given that he confessed to his crimes.
Is it because he felt that he deserved more of a punishment, or was he trying to plea insanity? What's going on here?
I'm not really sure what went on here. I really couldn't get that much information I don't think he was trying to get more time. I think after he confessed, the reality set in that he was facing serious time.
Gotcha.
And he thought perhaps he could defend himself.
Got it.
I'm not sure what his defense would have been. I can tell you, however, that his plan absolutely backfired. Gary was convicted on all charges and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Good.
After being incarcerated, Gary sent an apology letter to Sarah.
Usually offenders cannot contact victims.
That's usually very true. I'm not sure if he got it to her through a third party or how it was, or if she agreed to accept it, but the letter did get to Sarah. He said that he felt ashamed of how he had abused their relationship, but Sarah wasn't quite buying this apology. Now, while Sarah was devastated that the man she'd looked up to as her father was really her tormentor, Sarah felt justice had been served with his conviction and sentence. But she and Anthony, they didn't find much support from family and friends. Sarah said that when she tried to share this information or tried to share what she had gone through with some friends at her church, she found that none of them wanted to hear about it. And they were very dismissive of, the trauma that she had pretty much been through. So Sarah tried to leave the past in the past. She said that she put it behind her, and she and Anthony went on to have 3 children together. Sarah also became a very successful freelance writer, but she still felt very ashamed and very sad that she had found no help from her church community because she felt like they were supposed to be her support. They were her family. And so she was very disappointed that she and Anthony basically had to shoulder the burden of the trauma by themselves without being able to talk to anyone else about this. But after many years, in 2017, the Me Too movement mobilized. And Sarah said that at this time, she felt a total new wave of support. And she felt like she was finally able to share her story openly and honestly. So Sarah spoke about what happened on the podcast Criminal.
Oh.
She also wrote an essay for the Washington Post, and she appeared on an episode, as I said earlier, of Evil Lives Here. Mm-hmm. Sarah said that these experiences and the support she found in sharing her story has been at least very healing for her. Mm-hmm. Now, Sarah has forgiven Gary, but she has no interest in seeing him again, unsurprisingly.
And I'm assuming that her mother divorced him after the court case.
Absolutely, yes. Now, that brings us to the end of our story today, but I'd like to turn to a brief discussion of the criminal act of stalking. I teach about stalking in my Women in Crime class. Do you teach about stalking in any of your classes, Amy?
Not really. Sometimes it comes up when we talk about, victimology.
Oh, I see.
I don't have a section on just stalking.
Okay. Victims of stalking are predominantly females, with approximately 75% of the victims being women. But that also leaves 25% of others who are stalked. So let me also say most stalking victims know their stalkers, and many are former intimate partners. Often women or men who end relationships with abusive partners are the victims of subsequent stalking. which was the case with Dominique Dunn, who had covered in an earlier episode. Her former fiance had stalked her and then murdered her. There are several types of stalking, and there's a lot of different typologies, but I just want to cover the few original typologies. This is kind of the foundation for stalking as we understand it. There is the vindictive, rejected stalker, and that person is someone who threatens their victims because these are usually former romantic partners who have been rejected by the victim, and they are really fueled and consumed by anger. The second type is the intimate stalker. Now, they usually annoy their victims in an attempt to establish a relationship. They don't really mean harm, but yet they cause harm because they misconstrue any response from victims as a sign of affection or interest. The third category is the resentful stalker, and they usually seek revenge on someone they feel has wronged them, and they want to frighten them and even possibly harm them. Now, I also want to say, Amy, that there is a category of predatory stalkers who stalk strangers. And this is usually for the purpose of sexual assault or, like we see, unfortunately, with serial murders and other types of violent crimes. Now, in this case, and again, this is the old typologies. There definitely are different categories, just so you know. So it's not the only way to categorize stalkers. In this case, Sarah knew her stalker, but the case is very unique and it doesn't quite fit the usual categories. First, we should also acknowledge that her stalker began as a direct contact stalker, but then moved on to cyber stalking, which was interesting. And again, I think, as you pointed out, probably facilitated by the change in technology at the time. So does Gary fit in with these categories at all? And how do we explain his behavior? Those become the two questions and the reason I wanted to give you some context about stalking. And again, this is the reason I chose this case, the motives. So this is not a very straightforward case, Amy.
Also, you didn't mention this, but he also is a pedophile.
Yes, actually, you know what? That's a very good point. I'm not sure why I didn't include that as something, but yes, he's absolutely a pedophile. It's interesting. I think it's because he didn't necessarily make direct contact with her that we could also, I don't know for sure that he did. And he doesn't exactly fit the mold in terms of, I think his feelings certainly fit pedophilia, but he didn't perpetrate the crimes usually associated with pedophilia. So it's a little bit different, but I agree. I think he fits that mold as well.
I also wonder if, given the opportunity, would he have, or this was all just like a fantasy world for him?
Right. Exactly. So would he have or would he not have? Again, not straightforward here at all. And okay, so let's say even if he would have, what purpose is served by the stalking in the way that he stalked her? In sending pornography to his daughter or his stepdaughter? What was the purpose, I guess, is also a little bit different.
It's also very different than the fact that him sending the pornography, but then him spying on her, him taking her underwear. So it's like there must be like different goals for each of these types of stalking behaviors.
So I think that's what I'm saying. Was he escalating? Was it going to lead to something worse? Because, at first it was sending a letter, then it was sending some photographs of pornography, then it was sending sex toys, then it was breaking in, then it was stealing underwear. So was he actually working up to commit a much more substantial crime? And this is over a 9-year period.
Yeah.
Again, not straightforward. So if you look at just the stalking behavior, he doesn't really fit the traditional molds. No. I mean, maybe he's intimate, maybe he's resentful, but not quite. So these categories clearly can't encompass all situations. And also, here's another question, and this is a very important one. Did Gary select Sarah's mother as a partner because of Sarah when Sarah was a child?
There's also the question, is he dangerous to society, or is he just because he became infatuated with this one person? That doesn't mean that his punishment shouldn't be the same, but there's also a big difference when you look at an offender who's targeted for an individual and an offender who, if not her, someone else.
That's absolutely correct. He established a sexual fixation on Sarah, I think, pretty quickly after meeting her, which, does place him in the category of pedophile. By the way, I have that in my notes now, so I am acknowledging that. But
also,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there's no other evidence. I'm just wondering. So clearly he has feelings towards children if he started this when she was a child, but he followed it until she was an adult. So
exactly,
it's a very complicated case.
Exactly. And that's a very good point. And it was my next point after saying to him that even though he's a pedophile, it's different in that usually pedophiles, the age gap is what will differentiate the feelings, or the feelings will change.
Yep.
But Sarah was in her early 20s and Gary was still perpetrating these crimes against her. And in fact, that's when he was escalating, when she was an adult.
Yeah.
So what's the purpose of all of this? Here's what I think, but I really want your opinion if you can. I know it's very, very hard. I think stalking was a way to keep Sarah close. I think that it was a way to scare her so that he could become the hero or the knight in shining armor. I do believe that she would turn to him, help me, that he could feel that kind of validation that he needed. But I also think that his choice of the gifts and the letters he sent were to satisfy his own sexual fantasies and arousals. I think it excited him to know that she was opening sex toys and pornography and envisioning what he would do with these things. So I think this is a dual purpose.
Yeah, I definitely lean a little bit more towards, I agree it's a dual purpose, but I lean more towards he wanted to be her savior. And I wonder if it would have escalated for him. Like, again, is it just the fantasy, or was he eventually going to sexually assault her?
I want to say he probably wasn't, even though typically escalation does lead to assault in most offenders, especially like career offenders. I think that it's almost like he would have been too embarrassed or too ashamed to actually take it. So I think he wanted to push it as far as he could go without actually making that kind of direct physical contact, is what I think.
Yes.
And I also think, remember, as their fantasies, people come embroiled in some of these fantasies, especially even with serial offenders. One thing's not enough. It's not enough to send a letter. You need pornography. You need things. But I think him being identifiable to her was the one thing that protected her from an actual physical assault.
I hear you. That makes sense.
I also think, just so you know, in a lot of these cases with these types of offenders, they derive a lot of pleasure from the preparation, the delivery, the aftermath of the activities. There's a lot of pleasure that goes on for them in different phases. Gary's a sexual predator, I'd say, but one who also has a diverse criminal career. Remember, what I know or what I revealed was there was a credit card fraud. There's theft. There was patronizing sex workers. And I would bet that he has a long history of other types of criminal activities that started when he was young and ranged from very minor to somewhat serious.
Yeah, I also wonder if, I'm assuming they looked at his computers and such. I wonder if he was looking at child pornography or, what his interests were. And again, was it just her, or was he pedophile in other areas as well?
I think that's a very good point. I'm not aware. I'm sure they looked at his computers. And yes, I'm sure that was part of the evidence. But there wasn't a lot of information available about his trial. So I would have liked to see that information as well.
I also wonder if, sometimes we hear people who have pedophilia and, like they don't want to. They can't help it. It's almost, it's so he strikes me as someone who he knew that this was wrong probably, but he just couldn't help himself. So I think he's somebody that almost had a break in reality and realized he may need some help here.
That's an argument, as I've heard it in pedophilia. And it's one that's very complicated.
I know. And controversial.
Very controversial. Right. Is it, somewhat of a disease in that you will? Or is it, you know what I mean? Is it criminal? Can someone help it? At what level do we punish people? Could he have actually helped the behavior? Yeah, I think he could have helped behavior. But again, a very controversial topic, and certainly not one that I'm an expert on in that regard. So I will leave it for
the experts,
a later discussion, or someone who has better expertise to address that part.
I think that's a good idea.
Right. Okay, so in the end, this case took quite some time to solve. It was not easy, but it was Gary who undid it. So why couldn't they solve it sooner? Well, come on now. It was 1990s and early 2000s, so you might say that they really didn't have a lot to go on here. Or it wasn't, and possibly it wasn't taken as seriously because this was, male, right? This wasn't a physical harm. So the police might have looked this, hey, this is just pranks, someone trying to be funny. It's just pornography, no big deal, without recognizing the potential long-term harm.
Meghan, you talked about her journals, and I think it's safe to say that he was taking her journals, and that's how he knew about Hans. And he was probably using he was probably using her journals as a way to get into her life and to fantasize. Again, he's obviously the one who sent the email to all her contacts, humiliating her.
He was the one. Yes.
Yep.
He hacked her email, and he was absolutely the one who was stealing her journals.
And that him hacking her emails, I could understand, given his, profile, why he would use her conversations for his own purposes, but to humiliate her, that doesn't really fit with all of the other crimes.
I think it does. I think he liked humiliating her and making her feel bad. And I think that he thought that she would run to him. I've been humiliated. I've been embarrassed. Gary, please help me. What should I do? At least in his mind, perhaps. I think he liked also embarrassing her, and that was part of it. But I think it's both for the hero and because he liked to embarrass her. He's a very complicated offender, which I think is clear by the crimes.
Yes.
Earlier cases of harassment and stalking really weren't taken seriously either, as we've discussed, until the victim rights movement, and some very public cases of stalking that ended very badly in the 1990s. I think that's when it became acknowledged as much more serious than before. I have to say, in this case, I'm just relieved that that was not the ending. Sarah faced this head on, and she's found strength in telling her story and in overcoming her trauma. So it is my hope that others will find inspiration in her story, as I did.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing her story. It's definitely inspiring.
Yes, I think so. And a little bit of a change for us. Okay, so before we go today, though, we'd like to take this opportunity to answer a question from a supporter. Here's the question, Amy. What is the best way that listeners can support victims' families?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think for a lot of cases we cover, usually in action items, we put, the family has a GoFundMe or a Facebook group or something like that. So I think for individual cases, just doing a quick Google search to try to see what the loved ones, how they're rallying, how they're getting support for their loved one, I think that's the best way. If you're looking to support victims' families just more generally or just victim services, I think one good place to go is the National Center for Victims of Crime. So that's at victimsofcrimes.org. And there's a lot of information on how you can donate and, help support the cause. I also think victimassistanceprogram.org is another one that has a lot of links to ways that you can help. And then, of course, there's state programs, whatever state you're in. I know New Jersey has a lot of, victim services, so you could donate to, independent nonprofit organizations, depending on if you'd like to support, domestic violence, or if you'd like to support domestic abuse survivors, or if you'd like to support other types of survivors, then you can look into that as well.
I also think, just to add to that really quickly, it's sharing their stories, keeping their stories in the public eye. A lot of people write to us and ask if we'll cover stories because they're not getting enough attention. So keep the attention and focus on victims.
Yeah, good point.
Great question. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening today. And we'll catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include an episode of Evil Lives Here, The Washington Post, an episode of Criminal Podcast, and The Today Show.